the last few years, you'd have to say, the Human Rights Commission has been a participant in many of what I could only consider the culture issues, one might say debates, wars, whatever, that have permeated through the New Zealand social and political structure. It went conspicuously absent, I rather thought, during the shutdown of New Zealand and the cessation of rights to people who wouldn't get vaccinated. And as you know, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. In fact, there haven't been a needle I don't like. But when the human rights of a whole series of people who wanted to say no were clearly endangered and threatened by the government of the time, the human rights seemed conspicuously absent from that particular discussion, or at least holding the basic rights of the Human Rights Act. But that was my analysis of the time. Things have changed a bit since then, and certainly the personnel have. The new government has come in and made a series of appointments. The Human Rights Commission can have up to 5, I think, Human Rights Commissioners at one time. And our next guest is the Chief Human Rights Commissioner. He was appointed in November 2024, Dr. Stephen Rainbow. But he is by no means the only Human Rights Commissioner. There is Dr. Melissa Darby, who is the Race Relations Commissioner, again appointed in November 2024. We haven't heard a lot of her. Professor Gail Pachicha, I think that's the way to pronounce it, who became the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner. God knows what they do, we're about to find out. Prudence Walker, the Disability Rights Commissioner, and then someone called Dale Takatimu, who is the Ronomo Takitaki, whatever that is, the Indigenous Rights Governance Partner. So I think that's the 5. But Dr. Stephen Rainbow is the chair. Well, he's the Chief Human Rights Commissioner. What they actually do, who they do it with, in other words, how many people have they got working for them, what the issues of today are, well, those are topics for our discussion. And he joins us now. Stephen, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity, Michael. Appreciate it.
First of all, I've been around politics for a long time, but I've never quite worked out what the Human Rights Commission does. Can you tell me, please?
If we start with the Act in 93, which set up the Human Rights Commission, then essentially, well, at least in its current incarnation, I should say, look, we've got a number of different responsibilities, but I guess foremost among them, Michael, is the fact that New Zealand governments over successive political iterations have signed up to 7 international treaties. So they include treaties on issues like disability rights and ending racism. And the Human Rights Commission is essentially charged with ensuring that New Zealand is meeting its obligations under those treaties. So actually, a lot of what we do is focused on what I'll describe as the whole UN system, number one. Number two, in the last calendar year, I think we've handled more than 8,000 inquiries. So these are primarily inquiries and complaints alleging discrimination, and we have a process for dealing with those, some of which end up in mediation, which is extremely time-consuming and resource-intensive. Thirdly, we have submitted on over the last year around 20 different pieces of contemporary legislation from a human rights perspective. And then you mentioned my commissioner colleagues. We're all out on the road engaging with communities about, in particular, around social cohesion, but then there's also particular projects. And so you mentioned Professor Pacheco, for example. We've done work, well, at least the previous chair of the commission undertook a project around the Pacific pay gap. And so we're working in areas like that where there are human rights concerns. So we're out there advocating for human rights. We're out there listening to communities. We're out there engaging with people. So look, there's just that's a rough overview of what we do. But in any given week, we're engaging with many people, talking about human rights, listening to people's concerns, and as a result of that, I have to say, reducing probably quite a lot of pressure on the judicial system.
Did
Look,
you
there
say
are many other things.
reducing, did you say? And what do you mean by that?
So if we look at the 8,000 complaints that come into the Commission over
Oh,
the
right.
last
So
year,
they would normally go to court.
yeah,
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're reducing pressure on the courts.
So when the Human Rights Act came in 1993, which established you, it also established what human rights were. Well, it codified, I guess, what was common law practice at the time. Is that right?
Well, look, I think first of all, just to be clear, we've been established in 2027 for 50 years. So we
So it
weren't
came in
established by the
1987.
I think it was a little earlier than that. I think it was 77 that
You
we
might be
came
right,
into being.
actually. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So look, the human rights is evolving constantly. But the 93 Act is the primary act that we work under at the moment, along with the Bill of Rights Act, which you'd be well familiar with, which is more focused on civil and political rights. But that Human Rights Act has been around now for more than 30 years, and it might be time to relook at it. But it is the act that we work under at the moment.
Okay. Now, the Bill of Rights Act is something else. Again, that was done 3 years prior, 1990. I think most of us know that one. Do you have a responsibility to, if you like, administer or to rule on issues related to that? Or is that something that's related to just the courts and the judicial system?
No, we have a responsibility under that Act as well. And if you look at that Bill of Rights Act, that's much more focused on things like our democratic rights and our rights to participate, etc. So the two pieces of legislation ideally complement each other, but they certainly provide the context within which our priorities are determined. But we've just, as a new board, and you referred to the appointments in November, Michael, we've just come up with essentially a strategic plan for the next 4 years, and that's something that let's just say that was needed, and so in a resource-constrained environment, we have to focus on what our priorities are over the next few years, and so that's been a major focus of the new board. One of the things, for example, that we are wanting to do is a national human rights action plan, something we haven't had for, I think 2017 was the last one, and we're wanting to use that as the vehicle for a national conversation on several critical human rights issues, one of which would be, for example, the human rights implications of artificial intelligence, something that I think we need to be thinking more about than what we have done to date.
Okay. All right. Can you explain to me, though, I understand we've got a race relations considered. I think the first one, was Hiwi Taura, wasn't it? And I'm struggling from memory. Again, I think that was an appointment in the 70s. We've got an Equal Employment Opportunity Commissioner. I think that came in a little bit later. Disability rights certainly did. What is a Indigenous rights governance partner? Ronomo Takitaki.
The Rongamo Takitaki Dale Taki team is our Indigenous advisor to the board, and that was a decision that the previous board made in order to make sure that Indigenous rights were included in our mandate. Given that there's been, shall we say, a political contention over whether or not to have an Indigenous commissioner on the board. So Dale is our advisor on Indigenous rights.
Okay, yes, because you don't have an Indigenous rights commissioner.
That is correct.
Yeah.
We have a race relations commissioner, but not an Indigenous rights commissioner. That's correct.
Okay. All right. She is been appointed by the previous government, as you say. How long do you hold your positions for? 5 years?
No, Dale was appointed by the previous board of the commission, and we hold our appointments for 5 years. Dale's appointment is, because she's not a commissioner, is not for that duration. But look,
so is she an employee then? Is she?
Correct. That's correct. But
Yeah.
look, you know,
Okay.
we're an organisation which is, I would have to say, probably at the forefront of trying to work out what a treaty-based organisation is like, Michael. And so, you know, it's entirely appropriate that we have an Indigenous advisor advising us on our activities and making sure that they are highly visible in all that we do.
Okay. So you've raised the issue, I'll go to it now then, of the treaty or Te Tiriti as a based organisation. What do you mean by that?